Hey everyone, welcome back to the Study English Online, your podcast for easy English conversation, real daily life talk, and simple listening practice.
I'm Jake.
And I'm Anna. So, Jake, quick question. Do you find it easy to disagree with someone politely, or does it feel a little uncomfortable?
Honestly, it depends on the person and the situation. But in general, I think disagreeing politely is a skill I've had to actually work on over the years.
Right, and I think that's true for a lot of people. Disagreeing feels risky, like it might damage a relationship or create unnecessary conflict.
Exactly, and that's a perfect connection to our last episode about friendship too, since healthy disagreement is honestly part of maintaining strong, honest relationships over time.
Right. So today we're talking about how to disagree politely in English, useful phrases, techniques, and simple strategies for expressing a different opinion without damaging a conversation or relationship.
This is such a practical, valuable skill too, since disagreement happens everywhere, at work, with friends, with family, even in casual conversations with strangers.
Exactly. And for English learners specifically, knowing how to disagree politely rather than either staying silent or sounding too blunt makes such a big difference in how confidently you can communicate.
Before we start, quick reminder, if you enjoy this episode, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's learning English too.
And tell us in the comments, do you find it easy or hard to disagree with people? That's great writing practice too.
Okay, let's get into it.
Let's start with why this skill matters so much. Jake, why do you think polite disagreement is so important?
I think it's because disagreement itself is completely normal and healthy, but how we express it can either strengthen or damage a relationship depending on the approach.
Right. Avoiding disagreement completely, just silently agreeing with everything, might feel safer in the moment, but it often leads to frustration or even resentment building up over time.
Exactly. And on the other hand, disagreeing too bluntly or harshly can make the other person feel attacked or defensive or disrespected, even if your actual point is completely valid.
Right. So the goal is really finding that middle ground, being honest about your different opinion while still communicating with respect and warmth.
I think that middle ground is honestly the entire theme of today's episode, not suppressing your genuine thoughts and not bulldozing over someone else's, but finding language that holds both truths at once, your honest opinion and your genuine respect for the other person. Exactly. And that's really what today's episode is all about. Practical language tools for expressing genuine disagreement without unnecessary conflict or harshness.
I also think it's worth mentioning this skill matters just as much in a second language as it does in your first one, maybe even more, since a direct translation of disagreement from one language to another doesn't always carry the same tone.
Right, that's such an important point. Something that sounds perfectly polite in one language might come across as unexpectedly blunt when translated literally into English, simply because different languages soften disagreement in different ways.
Exactly, which is really why today's specific English phrases matter so much. They're not just translations, they're the natural, culturally appropriate way English speakers typically soften disagreement.
Jake, do you have a personal story about learning to disagree more politely? Actually, yes. Early in my career, I remember disagreeing with a colleague's idea during a meeting, and I said something like, "That's wrong, it won't work," very bluntly without softening it at all.
Oh, how did that go?
Not great, honestly. The colleague became noticeably defensive, and the whole meeting felt a little tense afterward, even though my actual point had some validity.
That's such a common experience, being right about the content but wrong about the delivery.
Exactly, and afterward, a mentor gently pointed out that the same point could have been made just as clearly, but far more kindly with a small adjustment in phrasing.
What kind of adjustment?
Something like, "I see where you're coming from, but I'm a little concerned about this part. Can we talk through it?" Same disagreement, same honesty, just delivered with more warmth and respect.
That's such a valuable lesson, and I think it really shows how much the wording itself matters, even when the core message stays the same.
Exactly. And ever since then, I've tried to be much more intentional about how I phrase disagreement. And honestly, it's made conversations both at work and personally so much smoother.
Did that mentor give you any other advice around that time that stuck with you?
Actually, yes, she told me something simple but powerful. You can be completely honest and still be kind. Those two things aren't opposites. That really reshaped how I thought about disagreement generally.
I love that. Honest and kind aren't opposites. I think a lot of people assume being direct means you have to sacrifice warmth, when really you can absolutely have both at the same time.
Exactly. And once I internalized that, disagreement stopped feeling like a choice between being truthful or being nice. It became about finding the version of truthful that's also delivered kindly.
That's such a valuable mindset shift, and honestly, I think it applies to almost every difficult conversation, not just disagreement specifically.
Right. Whether it's giving feedback, setting a boundary, or even ending a relationship, the same principle holds. Honesty and kindness really can and should coexist. Anna, what about you? Any personal experience with this?
Mine is actually the opposite problem. For years, I avoided disagreeing at all, even when I genuinely had a different opinion, simply because I didn't want to create any tension.
That's such a common pattern too, avoiding disagreement altogether.
Right, and over time I realized this actually caused its own problems. People didn't always know my genuine opinions, and sometimes I felt unheard or a little resentful, simply because I never spoke up.
So what changed?
I started practicing small, low-stakes disagreements first, gently expressing a different preference about something small, like a restaurant choice, before working up to more significant disagreements.
That's such a great, gradual approach, connecting nicely to our Small Steps episode too.
Exactly. And slowly I became more comfortable expressing genuine disagreement, using polite, respectful language. And honestly, my relationships felt more honest and balanced as a result.
Was there a specific moment where you noticed this change had really taken hold?
Actually, yes. A close friend once asked me directly, "You always seem to agree with everything. Is that really how you feel, or are you just being polite?" And that question genuinely surprised me, because I realized I had been hiding my real opinions without even fully noticing it.
That's such an honest, important moment, someone else noticing the pattern before you fully recognized it yourself.
Exactly. And after that conversation, I made a real conscious effort to practice expressing genuine opinions, even small ones, more consistently, using exactly the kind of polite phrases we've talked about today.
And how did your friend react once you started doing that?
Honestly, really positively. She said she appreciated finally knowing my real thoughts, and our friendship actually felt more genuine and trusting afterward, rather than less.
That's such a beautiful example of how genuine, polite disagreement can actually deepen a relationship rather than threaten it. Exactly the opposite of what I think a lot of people fear.
Right, and that fear that disagreement will damage a relationship is honestly one of the biggest reasons people avoid it in the first place. So it felt really meaningful to discover firsthand that the opposite was actually true for me.
Let's go through some specific practical phrases for disagreeing politely in English.
We'll cover phrases for softening disagreement, expressing a different opinion, asking questions instead of stating disagreement directly, and then specific phrases for casual and professional settings. Softening your disagreement. "I see what you mean, but," or "That's a fair point, however," these phrases acknowledge the other person's view before introducing your own.
Right. This technique is sometimes called the agree and pivot method, briefly validating their perspective before smoothly shifting into your own viewpoint.
Let's act out a quick example. "I think we should launch the product next month."
I see what you mean, and I understand the excitement, but I think we might need a little more testing time first.
Right. Notice how that response validates the original idea before introducing a different view, rather than jumping straight into disagreement.
A few more softening phrases. That makes sense, although, or I get where you're coming from, but both work similarly. Acknowledging first, then gently pivoting.
And one more useful one. You raise a good point, and I just add, which frames your differing view as building on theirs rather than replacing it entirely.
Expressing a different opinion. I actually see it a little differently, or I'm not sure I completely agree, are gentle, clear ways to introduce disagreement without sounding harsh.
Right, and I actually see it a little differently works really well too, especially in more professional settings.
For example, I think the meeting went really well.
I actually see it a little differently. I felt like a few important points didn't get enough discussion time.
Right, that's honest, clear disagreement delivered without any harshness at all.
A few more phrases here. I'm inclined to think otherwise, which is slightly more formal, or personally I lean toward a different view, which works well in casual conversation too.
And one more, that's not quite how I see it, which is direct but still gentle, especially useful when you want to be clear without sounding uncertain or overly soft.
Expressing different opinions. Sometimes, instead of directly disagreeing, asking a genuine question can open the conversation more gently. Have you considered this angle, or what made you come to that conclusion?
Right, this approach invites discussion rather than creating an immediate confrontation.
For example, I think we should cut this section from the report.
Interesting. What made you decide that? I actually thought that section was pretty important.
Right, that's gentle question opens space for explanation and naturally allows your own disagreement to emerge as part of a discussion rather than a direct confrontation.
Another useful phrase here, can I ask what led you to that idea? Which shows genuine curiosity while still opening the door for your own perspective.
And one more, walk me through your thinking on this, which invites a fuller explanation, often revealing useful context before you decide how or whether to share your own differing view.
Politely disagreeing in casual conversation. I hear you, but I think, or I get that, though for me it's a bit different. Work well in casual, everyday conversations with friends and family.
For example, this restaurant is definitely the best in town.
I hear you, but honestly, I think the place around the corner is even better.
Right, light, casual, and completely natural for an everyday conversation among friends.
A few more casual phrases. I'm not so sure about that. Or, I don't know, I feel a bit differently. Both work well for low-stakes, friendly disagreements.
And a fun one, too. I'll have to disagree with you there, but that's okay. Which adds a light, almost playful tone, perfect for friendly banter about small, unimportant topics.
Politely disagreeing in professional settings. I appreciate your perspective, but I'd like to offer an alternative view. Or, I understand the reasoning, but I have some concerns about this approach. Work well in workplace settings.
For example, I think we should proceed with this vendor.
I appreciate your perspective, but I'd like to offer an alternative view. I have some concerns about their pricing structure.
Right, that's such a clear, professional, and respectful way to disagree in a work environment. A few more professional phrases. With respect, I see this a bit differently. Or, I hear the reasoning, but I'd push back slightly on this point.
And one more useful professional phrase, especially for meetings. Building on that, I'd like to add a slightly different perspective, which frames disagreement as adding to the discussion rather than opposing it directly.
Right, that phrase, building on that, is such a clever way to introduce a different view while still sounding collaborative and constructive rather than confrontational.
Let's cover a few things worth avoiding during disagreement, since these can unintentionally escalate tension.
Right. Avoid absolute words like always or never. For example, you always do this tends to feel like a personal attack rather than addressing the specific situation.
Exactly. And avoid raising your voice or using a harsh tone, since tone often matters just as much as the actual words being used.
Right. And it's also worth avoiding dismissive phrases like, that's ridiculous, or you're wrong, which shut down conversation rather than opening it up.
I also think it's worth mentioning interrupting. Cutting someone off mid-sentence to disagree tends to feel disrespectful, even if your point is completely valid, simply because it doesn't allow them to finish their thought.
Right. Waiting for a natural pause, then calmly introducing your different view feels far more respectful than jumping in immediately.
And finally, it's worth avoiding making the disagreement personal, focusing on the idea or situation rather than criticizing the person's character or intelligence. This plan has some issues rather than "you're not thinking clearly."
Right. That distinction, criticizing the idea rather than the person, is honestly one of the most important principles in all of this.
I also think it's worth mentioning sarcasm, which can sometimes feel like a lighter way to disagree, but often lands as more hurtful or confusing than direct, honest disagreement would be, since sarcasm can easily be misread, especially across language and cultural differences.
Right, and for English learners specifically, sarcasm is honestly one of the trickiest things to both use and understand correctly. So when in doubt, direct but kind phrasing is almost always the safer, clearer choice.
I also want to talk about something beyond just the words themselves, tone of voice and body language, since these often matter just as much as the actual phrases you choose.
Right, even the most perfectly worded, polite disagreement can come across as harsh if it's said with a sharp, aggressive tone or with crossed arms and an irritated expression.
Exactly. A calm, warm tone combined with relaxed, open body language genuinely softens the impact of disagreement, making the other person far more likely to stay open to what you're saying.
Right. Simple things like maintaining gentle eye contact, nodding occasionally, and keeping your voice at a normal, calm volume all contribute to a respectful, non-confrontational tone.
I also think pacing matters. Speaking a little slower rather than rushing to get your disagreement out quickly tends to feel more thoughtful and considered rather than reactive or defensive.
Exactly. And even a small pause before responding, taking just a moment to think rather than immediately jumping in, can genuinely change how your disagreement is received.
Right. That small pause signals that you're thoughtfully considering what they said rather than simply waiting for your turn to argue back.
I also think facial expression matters a lot here too. A warm, relaxed expression, even a small smile, can completely change how a disagreement is received compared to a tense, frowning face saying the exact same words.
Right. And this becomes especially important in video calls or in-person meetings, where the other person can clearly see your expression, sometimes even more clearly than they can hear the specific wording you use.
Exactly. And for phone calls or voice messages where facial expression isn't visible, tone of voice becomes even more important. A warm, steady voice conveys respect, while a sharp or clipped tone can undermine even the most carefully chosen words. Here's a really useful technique worth mentioning, sometimes called the sandwich method, especially helpful in more sensitive or professional disagreements.
Right. This involves starting with something positive, then introducing your disagreement or concern, then ending with another positive or encouraging note.
For example, I really liked the overall structure of your presentation. I do think the middle section could be a little clearer, though. But overall, this is strong work.
Right. Notice the structure. Positive, disagreement, positive again, like a sandwich with the disagreement gently placed between two warmer, more encouraging statements.
This technique works especially well when giving feedback, since it helps the disagreement feel balanced rather than overwhelmingly critical or negative.
Right. And it's worth mentioning the positive parts should still feel genuine and specific, not just generic filler. Otherwise, the technique can start to feel a little forced or insincere.
Exactly. A vague, generic compliment followed by criticism can feel more like a formula than genuine feedback, so specificity really matters here.
I've actually used this technique quite a bit when giving feedback to newer colleagues, and I've noticed it genuinely changes how open they are to hearing the constructive part, compared to just leading directly with criticism.
Right, starting with something positive seems to lower people's natural defensiveness, making them much more receptive to the part that follows.
Exactly. And it's worth mentioning this technique works well for feedback specifically, but for a simple difference of opinion in casual conversation, it can sometimes sometimes feel a little too formal or structured, so it's really best suited for slightly more significant disagreements or feedback situations. Let's talk about a couple of specific, sometimes trickier situations. Disagreeing with someone in a position of authority, like a boss or teacher, and disagreeing with family members.
Right. With authority figures, it often helps to frame disagreement as a question or a request for clarification first, rather than a direct statement. Could you help me understand the reasoning behind this decision? Opens dialogue respectfully.
Exactly. And phrases like, "I want to make sure I understand correctly," is the plan to, can naturally lead into expressing a concern without feeling confrontational towards someone in a position of authority.
Right. And it also helps to choose your moment carefully. A private, calm conversation is often much more effective than raising a disagreement in front of a large group, especially with someone in authority.
Right. And family disagreements bring their own unique challenges too, since emotions often run a little higher with people we're closest to, and old patterns or history can sometimes make even small disagreements feel more charged.
Right. Phrases like, "I know we see this differently, but I want you to understand where I'm coming from," can help keep family disagreements calm and respectful, even on sensitive topics.
And it's especially important with family to separate the specific disagreement from the overall relationship, reminding each other, even during disagreement, "I love you, and I just see this one thing differently."
I also think it's worth mentioning that with authority figures specifically, timing matters even more. Choosing a calm, private moment rather than raising a concern in the middle of a stressful, high-pressure situation tends to lead to a much more productive conversation.
Right. And it also helps to come prepared with a specific, constructive suggestion rather than just a general complaint. I have a concern about the timeline, and I was wondering if we could consider extending it by a week. Feels much more productive than simply saying, "This won't work."
Exactly. Pairing disagreement with a possible solution shows that you're genuinely trying to help improve the situation, not just criticize it.
Right. That small reassurance can prevent a specific disagreement from feeling like it threatens the whole relationship. I also want to mention that norms around disagreement vary quite a bit across different cultures, which is really important for our international listeners to understand.
Right. In some cultures, direct disagreement is fairly common and accepted, even expected in professional or academic settings, seen as a sign of honest engagement rather than disrespect.
In other cultures, direct disagreement, especially with someone older or in a position of authority, might be considered quite rude, with indirect disagreement or silence being the more culturally expected response.
Right. So if you're navigating disagreement in an English-speaking environment, it's worth observing and learning the specific norms of that particular workplace, school, or social group, rather than assuming one universal approach applies everywhere.
Exactly. And if you come from a culture where indirect disagreement is more common, it might feel initially uncomfortable to disagree more directly in certain English-speaking contexts, but with practice, using the polite phrases we've covered today, it becomes much more natural over time.
Right. And it's also completely fine to communicate your own cultural comfort level, too. Something like, "In my culture, we tend to be a little more indirect, so please let me know if I ever come across as too blunt," can be a lovely, honest way to bridge that cultural gap.
I also think it helps to stay curious rather than judgmental when navigating these cultural differences, remembering that a more direct or more indirect communication style isn't inherently better or worse, just different, shaped by different cultural values and history.
Right. And honestly, being aware of these differences and asking questions when unsure, is it common here to disagree openly in meetings, for example, shows real cultural sensitivity and genuine respect for the people you're communicating with.
I also want to briefly mention disagreeing in writing. emails, messages, or comments, since this comes with its own specific challenges, mainly the lack of tone of voice or facial expression.
Right. Without those extra cues, written disagreement can sometimes come across as harsher or colder than intended, even when that's not the writer's actual intention at all.
Exactly. So in writing, it often helps to be even more deliberately warm and clear than you might be in spoken conversation, using phrases like, Thanks for sharing this. I did want to raise a small concern, or I really appreciate the effort here, though I see a couple of areas we might adjust.
Right, and it also helps to avoid writing messages in the heat of a strong emotional reaction. Sometimes it's worth drafting a response, waiting a few minutes or even a few hours, and then reviewing it again with a calmer, clearer mind before actually sending it.
Exactly. That small pause before hitting send can prevent a lot of unnecessary misunderstanding or unintended harshness in written disagreement.
And finally, emojis or a simple friendly opening line like, "Hope you're doing well," can help soften the overall tone of a written disagreement too, especially in more casual or informal written communication.
Here's a distinction worth mentioning too. Disagreeing about a factual matter tends to require slightly different language than disagreeing about a personal opinion or preference.
Right, for factual disagreements, phrases like, "I think that might not be quite accurate from what I've read," or "I believe the actual figure is a little different," work well since they gently introduce correct information without sounding accusatory.
Exactly. And for opinion-based disagreements, phrases like, "I see it differently, but I understand why you'd feel that way," acknowledge that reasonable people can genuinely see things differently without either person necessarily being wrong.
Right, that distinction really matters, since factual disagreements can often be resolved by simply checking a reliable source together, while opinion-based disagreements might never fully resolve, and that's completely fine too.
Exactly. Recognizing which type of disagreement you're actually having helps you choose the right approach and the right expectations for how the conversation might conclude. Here's an important, related skill worth mentioning: knowing when a disagreement is genuinely worth expressing and when it's healthier to simply let something small go.
Right, not every small difference of opinion needs to be voiced. Sometimes a minor preference, like which restaurant to choose, really isn't worth a debate, and it's perfectly fine to just go along with it.
Exactly. This is sometimes called picking your battles, choosing to speak up on things that genuinely matter to you while letting smaller, less significant disagreements pass without comment.
Right, and I think a helpful question to ask yourself is, will this matter to me in a week or a month? If the honest answer is no, it might be a good candidate to simply let go.
Exactly. And this isn't about suppressing your genuine opinions either. It's about being intentional, saving your energy and your voice for the disagreements that truly matter, rather than debating every small thing.
Right. And interestingly, being selective like this can actually make your disagreements, when you do choose to voice them, carry more weight and be taken more seriously by others.
I also think there's a healthy balance to find here. Someone who never lets anything go can come across as argumentative, while someone who never voices any disagreement at all can come across as passive, or even seem like they don't have genuine opinions.
Right. The goal is really finding your own personal balance, being thoughtful about which disagreements genuinely matter to you, while staying comfortable letting the smaller, less significant ones pass without much concern.
Let's clear up a few common myths about disagreement before continuing.
Myth 1. A good relationship means never disagreeing. Actually, healthy relationships, whether friendships, family, or professional ones, almost always involve occasional disagreement. It's a sign of honest engagement, not a sign of a broken relationship.
Right. Relationships without any disagreement at all are often actually less healthy, since it might mean one person is constantly suppressing their genuine opinions to avoid conflict.
Myth 2. If I disagree, the other person will think I don't respect them. With the polite techniques we've discussed today, respectful disagreement actually demonstrates respect, engaging honestly with someone's ideas rather than dismissing them through silence.
Right. Silence can sometimes be interpreted as indifference, while thoughtful, polite disagreement shows you actually care enough to engage seriously with what they said.
Myth 3. Disagreement always leads to conflict. With the right approach, tone, and timing, disagreement can actually strengthen a conversation, leading to better ideas, deeper understanding, and stronger relationships, rather than automatic conflict.
Right. Conflict usually comes from how disagreement is handled, not simply from the disagreement itself existing.
Myth 4. One more worth mentioning. If I don't say something now, it doesn't matter. Small, unspoken disagreements often don't just disappear. They can quietly accumulate over time, sometimes resurfacing later as frustration or resentment, even about something that originally seemed minor.
Right, that's such an important point. Choosing not to speak up occasionally is fine, as we discussed, but consistently suppressing every disagreement can eventually affect a relationship in ways that are harder to address later. We received a great message from a listener connecting to today's topic.
Oh, tell us.
He said he used to avoid disagreeing with his manager at work entirely, worried it might seem disrespectful or risk his job.
That's such a common workplace fear.
Right, but he said he eventually learned to use softening phrases like, "I see your point, but I have a concern about this," and found that his manager actually appreciated his honest, respectfully delivered feedback.
That's such a great example of how polite disagreement, when done well, can actually build respect rather than damage it.
We also received a second story from a listener learning English who felt especially nervous about disagreeing in a second language, worried her phrasing might come across as ruder than intended.
Oh, that's such a relatable concern for English learners specifically.
Right, she said she used to either stay completely silent or accidentally sound overly blunt since she didn't yet know the softer, more natural phrases we've covered today.
That's such an honest struggle, the gap between knowing what you want to say and knowing how to say it gently in a new language.
Exactly, and she said once she learned a few simple softening phrases like, "I see what you mean, but," her confidence in disagreeing during English conversations improved dramatically.
That's such a wonderful example of how a small amount of specific vocabulary can make such a meaningful difference in how comfortable and confident you feel communicating.
Right, and she mentioned that people around her actually responded much more positively too, since her disagreements now felt thoughtful and respectful rather than accidentally blunt.
Did she mention how she actually practiced these phrases before using them in real conversations?
Actually, yes. She said she practiced saying them out loud alone at first, sometimes even in front of a mirror, just to get comfortable with the rhythm and tone before trying them in a real live conversation.
That's such a smart, low-pressure way to build confidence, practicing privately first before using new phrases in a higher-stakes real conversation.
Right, and she said after a few weeks of that private practice, using the phrases in real conversations started to feel much more natural and automatic rather than forced or rehearsed.
Let's spend a little more time connecting this directly to English learning, since it's honestly such a valuable, practical skill for learners specifically.
Right. A lot of English learners actually know grammar and vocabulary quite well, but haven't specifically learned the softer, more natural phrases needed for polite disagreement, which can unintentionally make direct translations from their native language sound overly blunt in English.
Exactly. This is a great example of something that isn't really about grammar accuracy at all. It's about natural, appropriate register and tone, which is honestly just as important for real-world communication.
Right. And the good news is, like we discussed in our Small Habits episode, you don't need to memorize every possible phrase at once. Learning just 2 or 3 softening phrases really well and using them consistently already makes a huge difference.
Exactly. Maybe start with just, "I see what you mean, but," and "I have a slightly different view," and practice using those specifically this week in any small disagreement that comes up naturally.
Right. Small, consistent practice with just a couple of phrases will build genuine confidence far more effectively than trying to learn everything from today's episode at once.
I also want to add, listening to natural conversations like this podcast or English shows and podcasts generally is a great way to notice these softening phrases in real, authentic use, which helps them feel more natural when you eventually use them yourself.
Right. Paying attention to how native speakers naturally soften disagreement in real conversations gives you a much better sense of timing and tone than simply memorizing a list of phrases.
We got a question. What if I disagree, but the other person gets upset anyway, even when I'm polite about it?
That's such an honest, fair question. Sometimes, even with the most polite approach, someone might still react emotionally, and that's not necessarily a sign you did something wrong.
Right. You can control your own delivery and tone, but you can't fully control someone else's reaction, and that's okay.
I also think it helps to remember if someone gets upset even after a polite, respectful disagreement, it often says more about their own current emotional state, stress, sensitivity to that particular topic, than it does about how well you handled the conversation.
Right, and in that situation, it's usually best to stay calm, avoid escalating further, and perhaps gently suggest revisiting the topic later, once emotions have settled a little. I can see this is a sensitive topic. Maybe we can talk more about it later.
Exactly. Giving both people a little space and time often allows for a much more productive conversation later, rather than pushing forward in a heated moment.
We also got a related follow-up question. What if I'm the one who gets upset when someone disagrees with me? How can I handle that better?
That's such an honest, self-aware question. I think it helps to pause for a moment before responding. Take a breath and remind yourself that disagreement isn't a personal attack, even if it feels that way in the heat of the moment.
Right. And it can help to say something simple, like, "Let me think about that for a moment," which gives you a little space to process your emotional reaction before responding, rather than reacting immediately and perhaps too strongly.
Exactly. And over time, with practice, most people find that disagreement feels less threatening and more like a normal, healthy part of honest conversation.
I think it also helps to remind yourself in that moment that being disagreed with doesn't mean you're wrong or that the other person doesn't respect you. It simply means two people see something differently, which is completely normal.
Right, and separating your own self-worth from any single opinion or idea being challenged is honestly a really valuable lifelong skill, well beyond just English learning or conversation specifically. I see your point, but I have a slightly different view.
I hear what you're saying, though I see it a bit differently.
That's a fair point. However, I'd like to offer another perspective.
I understand your concern, but I have some reservations about this.
I appreciate your feedback, but I respectfully disagree.
Let's also try a couple of slightly longer sentences.
I understand where you're coming from, but I see this a bit differently.
Could you help me understand the reasoning behind that decision?
I really liked your idea, though I do have one small concern about the timeline.
Try saying one of these sentences out loud today, maybe in a real conversation this week.
And if you're feeling ambitious, try writing your own version of one of these sentences, describing a real disagreement from your own life, past or present.
Let's review a few useful words from today's episode.
There's quite a bit of vocabulary today, since this topic really benefits from having several specific phrases ready to use naturally. First, to soften, meaning to make something less harsh or direct.
For example, I softened my disagreement by acknowledging his point first.
Next, an alternative view, meaning a different perspective or opinion.
For example, I'd like to offer an alternative view on this topic.
We also used reservations, meaning doubts or concerns about something.
For example, I have some reservations about this plan.
And finally, respectfully, meaning in a way that shows respect and consideration.
For example, I respectfully disagree with that decision.
One more useful phrase, to push back, meaning to resist or challenge an idea, often gently. I pushed back a little on the proposed timeline.
And to escalate, meaning for a situation or conflict to become more intense or serious.
For example, I stayed calm to avoid letting the disagreement escalate.
Try using one or two of these words today, maybe in a comment describing a disagreement you handled well.
And one final word, constructive, meaning intended to be helpful or useful, rather than simply critical.
For example, I tried to make my feedback constructive rather than just negative.
We talked about why polite disagreement matters, avoiding both silent agreement and harsh bluntness.
We shared our own stories, my experience avoiding disagreement altogether, and Jake's experience learning to soften his delivery, along with the valuable lesson that honesty and kindness aren't opposites.
We covered useful phrases for softening disagreement, expressing different opinions, and asking questions instead of stating disagreement directly.
We talked about what to avoid: absolute words, harsh tone, and dismissive phrases.
And we shared a wonderful listener story about disagreeing respectfully at work.
We also covered the role of tone and body language, the sandwich method, disagreeing with authority figures and family, cultural differences in disagreement, disagreeing in writing, facts versus opinions, knowing when to let small things go, and common myths about disagreement.
Before we close, one last small tip. This week, try using just one softening phrase from today's episode in one small, real disagreement, even something minor.
Right. Maybe it's, "I see what you mean, but," with a friend, or "I have a slightly different view" at work. Small, low-stakes practice builds real confidence over time.
And remember that mentor's advice from earlier. You can be completely honest and still be kind. That's really the heart of everything we talked about today.
And if it feels a little awkward at first, that's completely normal too. Just like any new phrase in a new language, it takes a few tries before it starts to feel natural and automatic. Next time, we're going to talk about something a little different: how to ask for help in English without feeling awkward, useful phrases for reaching out when you need support.
That connects nicely to today's episode too, since both skills, disagreeing politely and asking for help, involve being honest about your needs while staying respectful and warm.
Right. Both really come down to the same underlying idea: communicating something a little vulnerable or difficult in a way that still feels warm, clear, and respectful. We're really looking forward to that one.
If you enjoyed this episode, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what's one polite disagreement phrase you'll try using this week.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you in the next episode.
Bye!
Bye!